2024 was dubbed a super election year. Around half the world's population in dozens of countries went to the polls over the last 12 months, and many voted resoundingly for change. Professor Rodrigo Prano is the director of the Jeff Bleich Centre for Democracy at Flinders University, and he joins us now from Adelaide. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you remind us what some of the most significant of these more than 70 elections were in 2024?
Yeah, so 72 countries precisely voted in 2024. That accounts for about 4 billion people going to the polls, which is extraordinary for any year. We think it's the year that the most people voted in human history, essentially. So some of the highlights, of course, the United States voted in November, but also the United Kingdom in July, France in the middle of the year, India, Indonesia, Japan, and many other countries.
And as we mentioned, one of the common themes across a lot of those major elections was the rejection of incumbency. In the US and the UK, we saw governments lose office. In India and South Africa and Japan, we saw governments lose their majorities. What were the major drivers of voters saying we've had enough?
Well, I think that the issue right now across several of these countries is the situation with the economy, the economic situation. The cost of living crisis all over the world, issues with the supply chain that started with COVID and continue after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have created an economic situation that people are struggling with. The extremely high cost of energy throughout the globe is another issue that has contributed to this cost of living crisis. And I think people around the planet are essentially trying to do anything they can to change things and to secure for themselves a better future.
With those big global factors like cost of living and the energy crisis being such big factors, I suppose, in these elections, is there anything that those incumbent governments you think could have done differently to win re-election?
Well, that's a very complicated question. They definitely could have done things different, but the problem is that when we study electoral behavior, especially when you're talking about national elections, so to choose a president or a prime minister or a majority party in parliament, we always say that there's only so much that the incumbent can do in order to fix the cyclical economic changes that happen throughout time. The issue is that even though there are some things governments can do, they can't fix magically the situation from one second to the other. Voters tend to cast blame to whomever is in power. So essentially, in the case of an economic crisis, incumbent parties and incumbent candidates tend to suffer from the downturn of the economy, even though they can't really magically fix things with from one moment to the other.
And of course, we've got an election coming up at some point soon here in Australia. How, Dr. Prano, do you think that the results that we've seen around the world portend for the upcoming election in Australia?
I think it's very interesting that even in countries where the current majority was able to hold, as you mentioned, in India and Japan and South Africa, there were losses and they ended up with a minority government. In France, for example, the center and the left were able to stop with a historic agreement during the runoff elections, the far right. But then a few months later, only 3 months into the government, their government fell with a no confidence vote. So I think change is in the air. I think that as Australia goes to the polling booth at the beginning of 2025, most likely, it's going to be a very hard battle for the incumbent government. I think that the issue is that people do want change. People are looking for change. And so the incumbents will have to put up an incredible, formidable campaign in order to secure victory, in my opinion, at this stage.
Yeah, the election hasn't even been called yet in Australia, and we're getting some subtle election campaigning already going on. Jim Chalmers this week acknowledging that people are having a tough time, but urging people to stay positive for the future. Do you think that that is enough for politicians to urge people to hang on when they are experiencing such a difficult time? It's something that obviously didn't work so well for Democrats in America, who campaigned quite a lot on joy and optimism, yet didn't manage to secure another term.
Exactly. You got absolutely right. We can look into what happened in the United States, where the Democrats tried to put up this strategy of optimism, of mild change, incremental change, and it doesn't seem to work, right? Donald Trump was able to point back to a past where people felt that they were better off, and voters acted accordingly with a very clear, decisive victory for the Republican Party and Trump in the case of the U.S. So I think there are elements that we can look into what happened throughout this big year of elections in 2024 to see that it may not be enough to just come up with optimism. What we really need are plans, specific policy choices and policy plans on how we are going to move forward and how we're going to fix the issues that we are facing.